Part 2. The Battle. Chapter 8. Menelik's March. It was a Saturday, market day in Addis Ababa, in September 1895. Two heralds made their way to the top of a mound overlooking the market. Each carried a staff topped by banners of red and green. A horn sounded. People gathered round to hear an imperial proclamation. The emperor was calling the nation to arms. Ethiopia was going to war. Sometimes being a leader means knowing what not to do. When Menelik learned of Mangasha's defeat in January 1895, he did nothing. And when he heard in March of the Italian occupation of Tigray, as far south as Lake Ashenge, Menelik did not race to drive them out. In Africa and in Europe, Menelik's failure to respond immediately was taken as a sign of cowardice. Menelik is a myth, a remark attributed both to Tekla Haymanot and to Major Pietro Toselli, summed it all up. After all, Italy had just taken a Connecticut-sized bite out of Ethiopia, but Menelik dawdled at home in the south. Although Italy made no explicit territorial claims from Aksum to Dagrat to AMBW, it now occupied an additional 7,000 square miles of Ethiopian territory, an area bigger than Belgium or Ecuador. Moreover, the occupied area included the ancient holy city of Aksum, reputed home of the Ark of the Covenant and the historic coronation city for Ethiopia's rulers, the equivalent of Charlemagne's Aachen. No self-respecting ruler of Ethiopia could let such an affront stand. In fact, nearly a year would pass between Mangasha's humiliating rout at Koatit and Sanafe and the first Ethiopian rejoinder at a place called AMBW. Yet Menelik knew that while his power could withstand the doubts of those who saw fear in his hesitation, it could not withstand defeat. Moreover, Tigray, the northern province now claimed for Italy, was a restless land. Menelik, a southerner, had only nominal authority there. Although 6 years had passed since he had laid claim to the emperor's title, he had never visited Tigray. He ruled the province only through rebellious lieutenants. Menelik would have to demonstrate his authority in a place where it had never been secure. Ethiopia's rising, the mobilization. What should Menelik do? A court pressure to respond vigorously was acute. Empress Taitu, her brother Raswele, and her fellow northerners Mangasha and Alula wanted immediate action. But war would have to wait. Military campaigns are shaped by the seasons. Heavy, sometimes violent rains fall in the summer months in Ethiopia, impeding all but the most determined travelers. Menelik waited, and behind the scenes he prepared. In April 1895, he ordered a special tax to pay for rifles and cartridges. He courted the Muslim dervishes, sending gifts of horses and coffee. Menelik played down their long-standing religious differences, emphasizing instead a common racial heritage. I am black and you are black. Let us unite to hunt our common enemy. Finally, in September 1895, at the end of the rainy season, Menelik issued his call for a national mobilization. He also ordered all Italians expelled from Ethiopian territory. Ethiopia did not have a national army. What it did have was a strong military tradition that made service in the national militia an obligation, both patriotic and religious. The organization for this militia has been called feudal. Given the personal nature of the military service obligation, the claim has an element of truth. In effect, the order passed down the chain of command from the emperor to the Ras and regional governors and thence to the heads of district. The call to arms started with drumming, which stopped all work and all conversation. Then the proclamation was made. Within minutes, men were riding off in all directions to relay the news. Shield lands rifle, and 10 days' supply of food. These were the requirements of the soldier. Women prepared thick bread cakes. Horns were filled with red pepper and butter. Cartridge belts were slipped over the soldier or around the waist. Rifle muzzles were stuffed with scraps of wood or a rag to keep out dirt in the march. Swords were strapped to the right hip, following Ethiopian custom. All able-bodied men answered the call to arms, and from the local district they moved toward established rendezvous points on the appointed day. Ad hoc recruitment served Ethiopia well, notably in its struggle against Egyptian expansion. The risk in such an informal system, of course, was the threat of disloyalty. Menelik was the king of Ethiopia, a position he had clawed his way into from his secure base as king of Shoa. As emperor, he relied upon a web of relationships that depended variously on blood, marriage, trust, and fear. In the end, the success of the mobilization would depend on the strength of those relationships. Menelik's closest supporters included his cousin Mekonnen, Wale, brother of Empress Taitu, and Mikael, a convert from Islam and viceroy in the land of the Wello Oromo. When he needed Mangasha, the resentful son of Emperor Yohannes, and restless governor of Tigray, Takle Haimanot, the king of Gojam and rival for the throne, and Alula, a patriot who resented Menelik's dealings with the Italians, these relationships would be tested on the march. Some would fray. Up until the eve of Adwa, Italian strategic assessments crackled with speculation about who might peel away from Menelik, leaving his army and Ethiopia itself exposed to a fatal division. Menelik would lead a march northward from Addis Ababa, starting on October 11th. Troops in the south were instructed to converge on Wara Ilu, 155 miles northeast of the capital, while subordinates further north were to join him en route at Lake Ashenge and Mekelle, respectively 250 and 310 miles north of Addis. These northerly assembly points would save the men the trouble of marching south to Addis only to march north. They would also reduce the colossal footprint of Menelik's army. Ethiopian peasants were happy enough to produce tribute for Menelik on his way north, but there could be no mistaking the devastation the passing of the emperor's army would inflict. There were limits to hospitality. When Menelik's army eventually headed south again after the Battle of Adwa, villages would be far from pleased to see the emperor again. The march begins. Menelik and Taitu traveled with the pomp but also the purpose of a Renaissance court. Theirs was no conventional military campaign. With every step, the imperial couple would be testing public opinion and the loyalty of those who had pledged to join the defense of Ethiopia. The imperial court proceeded at a steady pace. As Menelik's men pressed onward, they marched surrounded by the din of drums, horns, and song. The sheer scale of the Ethiopian army, among the largest Africa had ever seen, gave the impression of an irresistible flow. Whenever the terrain allowed it, the troops of Ras Mikael and Ras Wele peeled away from the main army, flanking Menelik's troops in columns on either side. These dispersed movements minimized bottlenecks, enhanced security, and reduced the impact of the population. These parallel armies widened trails as they went, undaunted in their progress. As they crossed adjacent passes, securing the way of the emperor, they formed a spectacle of billowing shamas and bobbing rifles and lances, the mark of the citizens' army. One chronicler captured the pageantry of the event, recounting how drums beat and trumpets blared as if to say, "Courage and fortune is yours," while minstrels sang in mock astonishments. "Oh wonder, they came to conquer Abyssinia, crossing the sea on a boat." Taitu gloried in a march that radiated splendor and power. Her entourage dwarfed all of emperors, which she followed on the march. A mounted soldier sounded a shrill horn to announce her imminent arrival. Then came a military guard, followed by the empress herself, veiled and mounted on mule or horseback. Taitu's mount was led by Balcha, a trusted lieutenant and eunuch who, along with the jobs of imperial treasurer and chief artilleryman, had the honor of holding the imperial reins. She was followed at a distance by a formation of women, also mounted and arrayed in a semicircle. Each member of the empress' entourage carried a brightly colored umbrella, forming a throbbing cluster of color at the heart of the march. Taitu's group included thousands of soldiers armed to the teeth, but the ladies of the court added color, and Taitu's musical detail alone numbered over 100, men and women, singers and performers. Thanks to them, the empress never lacked for a soundtrack. Taitu preferred the music of the masenko, a fiddle-like instrument common to East Africa. Though to compare it to a fiddle misrepresents the scale of this instrument. The single string of the fretless masenko is typically played with a bow by a seated musician who holds the instrument between the knees, somewhat like a cello. As such, the masenko was not well adapted to marching. Instead, Taitu's musicians plucked a marching melody on an 8-stringed guitar-like instrument. As Taitu's group moved out, her performance played and sang a musical motive that repeated after 4 measures. The end of the day was no less brilliant. It began with a harbinger, the group charged with the task of transporting and setting up the royal tents. They carried the disita, the emperor's tent of red velvet, the elfing, the tent of the empress, and the adarach, the tent used for royal audiences. The location of the disita, or joy, because seeing it meant that the day's march was over, determined the layout of the mobile court. Everything else in camp followed from the position of the disita. The placement of other tents, even the direction of the next day's march, which was indicated by the orientation of the tent door. If the tent was dismantled before sundown, the march would resume in the morning. If it remained, the following day would be a day of rest. Once the red tent was in place on the high ground dominating the camp, hundreds of royal sovereigns flew into action. Their task was to turn the royal campsite into a fully functioning imperial court. The emperor's tent, the Ilfing, was set up behind the red tent. If important business was to be carried out, or if the emperor would be entertaining, the emperor's great tent, the Adarach, 20 feet high, was set out in front of the Desita. Fabric for the tent roof was stretched across. Carpets were laid down on the ground, the emperor's divan was assembled, and cushions were set out. The tent walls of fine silk, transported by 15 mules on the march, were unloaded and hoisted into place. Green, yellow, and red pendants flew from the top. In less than an hour, the imperial court was ready for business. The imperial complex was enclosed by a screen of fabric 6 feet high, the openings of which were guarded by soldiers bearing spears and staves, controlling access to the imperial couple. Topology was taxonomy in the imperial camp. Proximity to the court was an honor. The placement of tents relative to the imperial core reflected the imperial hierarchy. The treasury tent was nearby, so was the imperial wardrobe. Then came the tents of the royal guard and the clergy. Beyond them were the mules, horses, and tack. Then came the working spaces of the royal servants, hundreds of them, charged with operating the royal kitchens, which included a tent for the royal bread, the sauce tent, the tent for royal drink, or taj, beer, ferment, brancha, eau de vie, and more besides. Royal provisions included grain, flour, and honey, as well as hundreds of animals for slaughter, some provided by locals, some driven with the march. The production of injera, the pancake-like bread that is staple of the Ethiopian diet, was a major preoccupation, requiring a mobile bakery, including several open-fire stoves, mitad, that operated through the night. In the morning, more than 200 mules would be loaded up with injera that had been baked, stacked, and packed into crates. The crates in turn were locked, covered with an animal skin to keep out dust, then strapped to the mules. Hundreds of mules were harnessed to the needs of the royal household and kitchens. The full army required thousands. Beyond the tents of the servants, guards, and key services came the tents of the major figures at court, Ras Mangasha and Ras Makonnen, as well as the Afenagus. In effect, Menelik's attorney general, but a man with a considerable military force at his disposal. Beyond them came the rank-and-file soldiers and their vast city of tents. Although Ethiopian armies could move with awe-inspiring speed, faster than any European army on foot, the stages in the northward movement were brief. Typically, the army marched for no more than 5 hours, and the pace was modest, about 5 miles per day on the opening stage from Addis to Lake Ashenge. Menelik was in no great hurry. Plenty of sacrifices lay ahead, and speed now would only thin mules, horses, and men at a time when they needed to protect a healthy reserve. Speed risked injury too. The passing of the imperial army and the court was the occasion for the completion of important public works. Roads were widened and washouts were restored. Even so, Ethiopian roads were not kind to wheeled vehicles. There would be no royal carriage. Menelik traveled astride a mule. But there were political and ceremonial reasons for their stately pace too. Menelik and Taitu knew that the mobilization was a kind of national plebiscite. They took reassurance from the size of the force that answered their call, as well as from the vast tribute they received in the form of livestock, grain, and drink along the way. They gave as well as they got. Menelik and Taitu made a point of halting at Taitu's fief at Ergubo, where she hosted a feast. Storehouses were opened and great quantities of food were distributed. September is the month of the chickpea harvest, and they were distributed liberally with flour, honey, butter, oil, and berbere, the characteristic spice mixture of Ethiopia. Taitu's properties were also famous for the quality of honey they produced and the tej made from it. The variety of flowers on Taitu's land produced honey with various taste qualities. The royal couple were tej connoisseurs. They especially relished a white honey that made a clear and fine tej. Feasts boosted morale. They also confirmed the status of Menelik and Taitu as generous patrons of the army and the nation. Parents even, who could be counted on to protect and provide for the children of Ethiopia. By the time the emperor's red tent was erected at Lake Ashenge in mid-December, Menelik had amassed a force of more than 100,000. Confident, in high spirits, equipped with modern firearms, including artillery, and outnumbering Italian forces by more than 4-1, Menelik's army was already rewriting the rules of colonial warfare. At the time that he built up his army, Menelik carefully crafted the image he wished to protect. Lowball estimates of the size of Menelik's army were leaked. These were eagerly picked up by the Italians. Menelik's court also produced rumors of rancor, that Makonnen would betray Menelik for the emperor's crown, that Tekle Haimanot would bolt with his army before he would fight. It was even put about that Menelik had been hit by lightning and struck dumb, or perhaps killed. Every scrap of news reassured the Italians and bolstered their confidence that they would face a small, fractured, and demoralized opponent.